more than 1,000 years before Athens ever called itself a democracy. A civilization on a tiny island left us almost no obvious kings, no massive city walls, no great stone forts, and frescoes where women seem to hold the highest seats. They made that strange balance work for centuries. Then, in one single afternoon, the sky turned black, and one of the strangest power systems in the Bronze Age began to fade from history. Was this an early experiment in something like equality, or are we just reading our hopes into the ruins? This is the story of the Minoans. You're watching AguPast, always genuine, unchanged past. Imagine the year 2000 BC. While much of the Bronze Age world is building walls and worshipping warlords, the island of Crete looks strangely different. From what we can see in the ruins, there are far fewer massive city walls, no obvious royal tombs like the pyramids, and almost no clear images of a single king ruling over everyone. While Egypt is burying pharaohs under mountains of stone and Mesopotamia is building war chariots, one island in the middle of the Mediterranean seems to be doing something no one else dares. Crete, home of the Minoans, has palaces with big open courtyards instead of brooding citadels. At sites like Knossos, we don't see the huge ring walls you find at Mycenae or later at Troy. Some Minoan towns did build defenses, especially in more troubled times. But for much of their history, the major centers seem surprisingly open to the sea and to the landscape around them. Their largest settlement, Knossos, spreads across roughly 6 acres and contains more than 1,300 rooms. Yet archaeologists still argue about where, exactly, the ruler sat. There is a famous stone seat in the so-called throne room, flanked by painted griffins. But it may have been a ritual chair for a high priestess or deity rather than a king's judgment seat. What we don't have are carved monuments boasting of named male rulers acting out their victories in endless rows. Instead, again and again, many of the most important frescoes and seal stones show women on the highest seats, wearing the most elaborate jewelry, leading processions, pouring libations to the gods, and watching sporting events from shaded balconies while men serve or perform below them. For a long time, scholars looked at this world and thought they saw almost no big, organized wars. Compared to other Bronze Age powers, there are fewer obvious siege scenes carved in stone, fewer mass graves packed with weapons, and far fewer swords and spearheads buried in elite tombs than you might expect. Today we know the picture was never perfectly peaceful. The Minoans clearly knew how to fight when they had to, but the balance still feels strange. More harbors than hill forts, more festivals than battle parades, more shrines and storerooms than barracks. This wasn't just advanced. It was a society that seemed to solve problems the rest of the Bronze Age hardly knew how to name. A sea-trading island culture where art, ritual, and everyday comfort were allowed to stand in the foreground far more than war. They had something very close to flushing toilets at a time when much of the world was still relying on simple pits in the ground. Clay pipes carried water to and from private bathrooms inside multi-story buildings at places like Knossos. Some rooms even had built-in stone seats and bathtubs with proper drainage, and the palaces used terracotta pipes to manage water in ways that look surprisingly modern today. They built one of the earliest known paved road systems in Europe, stone-paved routes linking major palaces to the coast. A 3,500-year-old Minoan road near Knossos is often called the oldest paved road in Europe, part of a network that connected centers like Knossos with ports such as Gortyn and Libena. Their teenagers, boys and girls alike, if the frescoes are right, took part in bull leaping. Running straight at a charging bull, grabbing its horns, and vaulting over its back in midair. If people actually did this as shown, it was one of the most terrifying sports the ancient world ever dreamed up. Their artists painted dolphins leaping through waves, octopuses curling around wine jars, and women with bright red lipstick and bare chests, confident, powerful, free. They developed a writing system we call Linear A. Over about 1,400 short inscriptions and tablets have been found, and to this day, not a single scholar has managed to read the underlying language with any real consensus. We don't know what they called their cities, their gods, or even themselves. What we do know is that, century after century, they were plugged into a trading network that reached across the eastern Mediterranean, moving olive oil, wine, textiles, metals, and probably luxury goods like saffron and purple-dyed cloth between Crete, Egypt, the Levant, and the Aegean Islands. Some older writers imagined this as a completely peaceful sea empire that needed no war fleet at all. Today, most archaeologists are more cautious. The Minoans clearly knew how to project power at sea when they had to, but their surviving art and architecture still put trade, ritual, and everyday life more in the foreground than battles and conquests. This wasn't just a civilization. It was an island world whose houses, roads, and water systems would make plenty of modern towns look a little bit embarrassed. Then, sometime in the 17th or 16th century BC, the balance on Crete was hit by a shock from the north. For people living in the ports along the north coast, it may well have felt as if paradise ended in less than an hour. About 110 kilometers north of Crete lies the volcanic island of Thera, modern Santorini. One afternoon, Thera erupted with a force modern volcanologists compare to some of the largest eruptions in human history, a blast that may have thrown tens of cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the sky. Its plume likely punched up into the stratosphere, and ash from the eruption has been found in cores and sediments all across the eastern Mediterranean. But the most immediate killer came from the sea. As the caldera collapsed and huge masses of hot rock and ash rushed into the water, they generated tsunamis that radiated out across the Aegean. Near Thera itself, the waves may have risen tens of meters high. By the time they crossed the distance to northern Crete, they were lower, but still powerful enough to smash harbors, tear out walls, and drag debris far inland. At sites like Palacastro, archaeologists have found tsunami deposits several meters above sea-level layers of sea sand, broken pottery and Santorini ash dumped on top of what used to be streets and houses. If you lived in one of those coastal towns, it would have looked like the sea itself had decided to erase your world. Knossos, inland and on higher ground, survived the waves. And this is where the story becomes less like a disaster movie and more like real history. The eruption did not erase Minoan civilization in a single afternoon. On Crete, many sites were rebuilt. Some archaeologists even see the decades after the eruption as the high point of Minoan palatial culture, new buildings, fine ashlar masonry, and a trading network that limped, then recovered. But shocks like this have long shadows. Harbors had to be cleared or abandoned. Ships were lost. Farms and terraces needed years of repair. Ash and climate disturbance may have hurt harvests across the wider region. In that weakened, reshuffled world, new powers on the Greek mainland slowly grew stronger. Sometime in the 15th century, BC, a century or two after the eruption, we see clear signs that Greek-speaking Mycenaean elites have taken political control at Knossos. A new script, Linear B, appears on clay tablets, used to write an early form of Greek. The art and architecture shift. More thrones we can recognize as seats of earthly rulers. more images of armed men and chariots, more of the familiar language of kingship and war from the rest of the Bronze Age. The people we call Minoans were not wiped out overnight. Genetic studies suggest they and the Mycenaeans were closely related. Over time, their descendants blended into the wider populations of the Aegean and the Minoans, the people who had turned this island into a maze of courtyards, harbors, and painted rooms, slowly stopped being the ones writing the story. They were not wiped out in a single night. They were folded into new kingdoms, their palaces repurposed, their language fading from clay tablets no one could read anymore. Their gods blurred into other gods. Their myths sank into other myths. Not exterminated, just absorbed. The Minoans were forgotten in the written record for more than 3,000 years, until archaeologists began to pull their story back out of the ash. Later Greek writers, Homer, Plato, Aristotle, never mention a civilization called the Minoans. When they told the story of where civilization and democracy began, they pointed to Athens, to themselves. For more than 3,000 years, the palaces on Crete faded into the background, until in 1900, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans began digging at Knossos and uncovered an entire Bronze Age world under centuries of debris and rebuilding. By then, the textbooks were already written. Democracy, we were told, began in Athens in 508 BC with Cleisthenes. Almost no one stopped to ask whether long before that, on a sunny island whose art puts women in the highest ritual seats and whose palaces look more like mazes than fortresses, people might already have been trying a very different answer to what power should look like. We can't prove it was a democracy or that it achieved anything like modern equality, but long before Athens ever called itself a democracy, someone on this island clearly chose ships over chariots, shrines over victory monuments, and open courtyards over city-crushing walls, and for centuries, that choice seems to have worked, until nature pressed the reset button in a single catastrophic afternoon. For most of history, the Minoans were just a rumor behind a myth. If you had asked a sailor in classical Greece who built the first great palaces on Crete, he might have said King Minos, the labyrinth, the Minotaur. A monster, a maze, a cruel king, not real people with real kitchens and real worries. But when you walk through the ruins at Knossos today, you don't see a monster's lair. You see staircases that go nowhere, light wells catching the sun, walls where color still clings after 3,500 years. You see bathrooms and drains and courtyards and storage rooms, all telling you the same quiet thing. Someone cared a lot about how ordinary days felt. Not just about victory monuments, not just about the glory of a single name carved in stone, about water that actually reaches your house, about light in the rooms where you live, about festivals worth watching from a shaded balcony. If all that can vanish so completely that we only find it again by accident, under a modern house on a hill in Crete, what does that say about the stories we are writing now? One afternoon of fire, ash, and water didn't wipe them out in a single heartbeat, but it helped push one of the strangest island civilizations of the Bronze Age into the shadows. Long before Athens ever called itself a democracy, the people of this island were already living under a very different idea of what power could look like, and we let a volcano bury their story. This is why the past keeps its very best secrets. Thank you for watching AguPast. If this story shifted the way you think about where civilization begins, hit like, drop a comment, what surprised you most about the Minoans? And subscribe, because next episode we're going to an African kingdom that had street lighting around 500 years ago. Now, if you want the historical anatomy behind this Minoan story, stay a little longer for historical notes. What was real and what we still debate. Before we close, a quick transparency note, because AguPast never wants to sell you myths as facts. Minoan timeline versus Athens democracy. The main palatial phase on Crete runs roughly from 1900–1450 BC, many centuries before Athens' democratic reforms, around 508 BC. So long before Athens called itself a democracy is true, but we cannot prove the Minoans had anything like a formal democracy. Kings, palaces, and walls. Minoan palatial centers like Knossos, Phaistos, and Malaya clearly had hierarchy and central administration, but very little clear king iconography. Some sites have defensive works, especially later in the Bronze Age, yet overall the palaces feel less like heavy fortress citadels than Mycenaean sites such as Mycenae and Tiryns. Women in high ritual roles. Many famous frescoes and seal stones do show richly dressed female figures in prominent ritual positions. Whether that means full political matriarchy is debated, but it is safe to say that women and goddesses are unusually visible in the surviving Minoan art. Plumbing, roads, and advanced comforts. The palace at Knossos really did have terracotta pipes, sophisticated drainage, and what is effectively an early flush toilet, along with paved roads linking major centers to the coast. We don't know exactly how every system worked, but the overall level of water management and infrastructure is genuinely impressive for the time. Bull leaping. Bull leaping scenes appear on multiple frescoes and objects, and most scholars agree this was some kind of real practice, though we can't be sure how often it was done or exactly who took part. Calling it one of the most dangerous sports the ancient world ever dreamed up is emotional language, but not far from how archaeologists themselves describe it. Linear A and lost names. Linear A, the main Minoan script, is still undeciphered. We have roughly 1,400 inscriptions, but no agreed reading of the underlying language. That's why, in this story, we say we do not know what the Minoans called themselves or their cities. The Thera eruption and tsunamis. The massive eruption of Thera, Santorini, in the 17th–16th century BC is real, and ash from it has been found across the eastern Mediterranean. Tsunami deposits linked to this event have been identified on parts of the north and east coast of Crete, including sites like Palakastro and near Malea. Our description of waves smashing harbors is based on that evidence, but the exact height of every wave and the precise chain of events are still debated. Mycenaean takeover and blending. After about 1450 BC, Linear B tablets show that Greek-speaking elites took control at Knossos, and art becomes more overtly Mycenaean. Ancient DNA studies suggest that Minoans and Mycenaeans were closely related populations who later blended, rather than one side completely exterminating the other. Everything else in this episode, the feelings, the way it might have looked to stand in a harbor when the sea came in, that part is storytelling built on top of the evidence we have. Thanks again. See you next episode.